Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, joined today with a former guest of the podcast, Tanner Pruett, and then we have new guest of the podcast, Yuji Suzuki. And today we want to discuss arm injuries in baseball. That's kind of a recent hot topic with a lot of guys going down early in the season. And Rob Gray from the Perception Action podcast recently did an episode with Randy Sullivan and Alan Jaeger, and they, I thought, brought up some really good points on like why guys are getting injured and how to prevent injuries. And so we wanted to riff off of that today and add our own 2 cents to that, and also kind of continue to approach this from an ecological perspective and kind of expand the conversation with regard to that. And so, Yuji, since you're new, could you give us a little intro to who you are and background on yourself?
Let's begin. Analyzing. Finding the edge.
Yeah, so my name is Yuji Suzuki. I am licensed as a chiropractor in the state of Oregon. I also have my CSCS, and more recently I've been doing a lot more work using my CSCS, kind of doing a lot of remote coaching. That's how I kind of got to know Tanner a little bit more closely. We've been working together for a little while. And I'm in this kind of unique position because of my education and continuing education. You know, I have understanding of pain and rehab and even biomechanics. I know that's kind of maybe a taboo topic in the ecological dynamics world potentially, but and combining that with, you know, the understanding of ecological dynamics, motor learning, skill acquisition, and appreciation for those things to try to marry them in my work, I guess, so that I can try to figure out how can I best help this person become most adaptable problem solver through the process of rehabilitation / readaptation.
Awesome. So, Yuji, what do you have a background in baseball? Have you?
Yes, I probably should have touched on that. Yeah, so I played baseball growing up. I grew up in Japan, and then I had, you know, my family moved to Toronto, and I had some opportunity. I was lucky enough to be able to play for a small D2 school in Minnesota, and then to continue on even a little bit after that in Japan after undergrad. But then, you know, I was okay being done with baseball, moved back to Minnesota to continue with my chiropractic schooling. So, you know, I played for probably close to 2 decades. I've stepped away from it a little bit during grad school just because I was so busy, but it's still a, you know, passion of mine to stay as close to baseball as possible. Yeah, does that kind of explain my background? Is there anything you want me to expand?
No, I think that's good. You know, it's always helpful to kind of know people's history with baseball and the game and the sport. And so I think this is good way to transition into what do you guys think is the main reason that guys are getting hurt? I guess you could say. I think that's a good kind of starting spot of why do you think there's a increase in injuries, especially with the pro guys who, I mean, I think Tanner, you can kind of speak more to this because you might have been around a lot more pro guys when you were at Tread. What do you think are the reasons that guys who have a kind of a longer history, in some ways should be more built up, especially through like spring training, all that sort of stuff? Why maybe the rash or the increase in injuries, you know, at the beginning of this baseball season?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's ever just one thing, but there is a lot of, especially in affiliated organizations, where they want their pitchers, they're prospects, they're guys that they're trying to develop to follow their program. And I'm not saying it's a bad program, but it's the same, almost the same program for every guy. It's not every organization, from what I've heard, but there's a good amount where, I knew a guy, he was done playing, but he had to retire because of injuries. And they told him, like, hey, you need to take 2 months off from throwing every offseason. And he's like, but I've never done that. All through college, all through high school, like my whole life, I threw year round. Not high intent, but I was always throwing in some way. And they basically said, well, you need to shut down or you're gone. Like, we're going to release you. And he was just like, okay, then I'll shut down. And so there goes 2 months of throwing, which is something he's always done, gone. Tried to build back up, wasn't built back up in time for spring training, dealt with injuries, on the DL quite a bit, or IL, whatever they call it now. But and he just had to be done. And so there's a lot of things like that. I could give example after example after example, but I think that is a big reason. And I would say the other reasons too are possibly almost on the other end, pitching too much on the off season. Almost like, I don't really know how to explain it, but just like throwing too much. Like, yes, you might not need to take time completely off, but do we need to be throwing max effort first week of the off season? Like, do we need to do that? Or do we kind of need to let the arm and body recover a little bit? Let's bring down the intensity, bring down the volume, keep throwing, because you don't want to lose that skill or have that skill diminish in any kind of way. But do we really need to go super high intent? I would say those are the main two. And then if we want to get into the minor details, I guess, I do think obviously the harder you throw, the more stress is on the arm. Like, I think that is just true. So if we're throwing too hard too often, we're going to break down a lot sooner. If we're not throwing enough and then we try to throw as hard as we can, then your tissues aren't built up for that. So I guess that's my perspective, just based on what I'm hearing or what I've heard from pro guys that I've been around, and kind of hearing their stories and seeing how they go through things or what they went through. But yeah, anything else you want me to touch on there? Or?
No, I mean, I think that's a good starting spot. I think the thing that kind of came up in my mind is, what are some of the underlying principles that I think drive injury? And so, Yuji, I kind of want to tap your expertise and kind of see what do you think, based upon your experience as a chiropractor and having a background in strength and conditioning. This is the same reason too that Tanner also has a background in strength and conditioning as well. So that's kind of why I want to have all you guys on. Is I think, to me, I always want to try to understand things at a principle level. So if I can understand the principles, then it becomes less. You can basically, the quote that I really like is, the methods are a million, but the principles are few. The one who understands principles can pick their methods. And so I think that's why I want to kind of start, or kind of move in this direction of what are some of the basic underlying principles that I think, that drive injury and or drive health. So, Yuji, what do you think are potentially some principles that kind of govern why is it that guys tend to get injured?
I think, it's a difficult conversation. It's complex. Like pain and injuries, that's a complex phenomenon. And it's, whenever we try to look for a root cause, or like the one thing that contributes generally to injuries, like that's very difficult to say. But one thing we know is that sudden change in exposure can be a really tough thing to overcome. If you think about dynamical systems, it's like sudden change to a system can kind of disrupt it. And human is the same thing. And they touched on this in Rob Gray's podcast too, where, spikes, like peaks and valleys, right, that are like too sudden, too much too soon, those can be a really difficult thing to overcome with other factors, right? So I think that might be one of the things that can be considered a principle in terms of like, hey, we don't want sudden and massive change in kind of several domains, whether that's intensity or volume or frequency, right? And humans don't do well when like sleep schedule is massively disrupted. And all of these are in play at the beginning of the season, right? Like your environment changes, your workload changes, your frequency changes. So I think it's one of the things that we need to consider when we are working through the off season from the get go. Like, okay, what are the demands that you need to be prepared for? And now that we have time at the beginning of the off season, we have to keep that in mind and not just think about how can I throw the hardest? How can I gain 2 miles per hour on my velo? Does that kind of make sense? We can't really like fake being prepared or being underprepared, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of where I think too, going off of like some basic principles. For me, the functional range conditioning, or Dr. Spina's work that he's done, he kind of laid out injury in a simple way. Like when the demand or the intensity exceeds the capacity of the tissue, you're going to get injured. And I think that's a very simple way to kind of based way to think about it. And that's where I thought they touched on really well in the podcast of, in the past, we've always thought about like reducing the amount of stress and like trying to mitigate. And I think that strategy has ill prepared, like we were kind of talking about, people for the demands of the sport. And when I think about like my job as a coach, whether it's a strength and conditioning coach or a position coach, it's my job is to prepare you for the sport. And so we have to begin to think about, okay, are we adequately preparing them to handle the demands of the sport? Secondarily, the other thing that Spina kind of laid out was, okay, you need to have some sort of stress applied in order to cause a response, right? Or just this is a basic S&C principle, right? In order for the tissue to actually change, you actually have to input stress into the tissue. Now, as long as it stays below the threshold of what the tissue can tolerate, you're going to get some sort of adaptation. But at the same point, if the stimulus is too low or whatever's input is too low, you're not actually going to get any sort of change. So for example, if it lies within the capacity, like well within the capacity of the tissue to do it, like say, for example, Yuji, perfect example right there. Picking up a cup and drinking, like you're not going to get, your biceps not going to really grow from doing 100 of those, right? It's well within the capacity of the tissue to do that. But if we add we add more weight to it, now all of a sudden it becomes a gallon jug instead of just a coffee cup. Okay. And you do that 100 times. That's going to provide some sort of stimulus to cause growth there. And so beginning to understand, okay, how do we influence the tissue to cause it to get the changes that we want? I think we were really good at, increasing the muscle strength, but we haven't really looked at, okay, what things can we do to increase the tendons and the ligaments? I thought this is where Dr. Spina's work, his new kind of program, like functional strength or whatever it's called, they talk about how you can influence the white tissue. So are we just working the red tissue, or are we working on the white tissue? So I think these are avenues that we need to begin to explore or to begin to think about when we're trying to prepare athletes for the game. I think the other principle for me, there was a really good book on recovery. I don't have the name pulled up right now, but I'll put that in the show notes. The big thing that they talked about in it was, on any given day, there's a maximal amount that you can recover from in terms of training volume. So if you exceed your maximal amount that you can recover from in whatever time frame that you need to be able to repeat the output that you just did, or to be able to do the thing, the movement, the action that you want to do again. If you exceed that, there's no amount of recovery that you can do to help kind of get you back to your previous level. And so I think that's an important thing to remember, that okay, whatever we're doing, we need to stay within our maximal recoverable volume if we want to be able to repeat. Let's just stick with pitching here, for example. If I want to be able to throw again tomorrow or within the next 5 days, I have to stay within or underneath my maximal recoverable volume. And so to me, that's a fundamental principle that is really important to consider when we are, trying to manage our athletes. Because I think, I have this propensity, and I'm sure you guys have run into this as well, of, okay, an athlete is struggling, they have, so for example, I have an athlete right now. I want to get into this at some point. We used a certain training modality to get him healthy. He was dealing with some, I want to say some nerve stuff, but some also tightness in his forearm. And he came in with like an injury in the fall. And I rehabbed him, got him to a point where he could throw at higher intent and be able to handle that. So then we get into the season. We basically were able to do what I was hoping to be able to do, which was get him to be able to handle everything in practice and be able to get through the season. Well, him being a catcher, the pitchers came to like him, and he was always available. So he ended up one day throwing or long tossing 3 times. And after that, his arm didn't quite feel quite as good after that. And so now he's dealing with some nerve stuff. And so to me, that's an example of exceeding his maximal recoverable volume that day. Like long tossing 3 times in a day, that's pretty hard for you to be able to recover from. That puts you in the hole. And now all of a sudden we have to begin to try to figure out, okay, how do we manage that? And a lot of times I think the first approach is, okay, what can we do to see if we can make that go away? Like, okay, we know that the nerve is getting impinged, probably at the forearm and the tricep level. I did some pails and rails with him, and it turned out, working the antagonist muscle relieved a lot of his symptoms in the forearm, but we never addressed the tricep. So now he's still getting pain with throwing and a little bit of numbness. So as an example, like, I think we tend to try to go to, try to find that thing that I found inadvertently of like, stimulating the antagonist muscle and it releasing some stuff. I think though we can't, and kind of the principles that came out of the recovery book is like, there's no modality that you can go to that's going to clear the issue when you exceed the maximal recoverable volume. And so for me, that's one of the big principles that I think we have to remember, is that when we are trying to build somebody up, we need to stay underneath that. But then also too, like, we have to educate the athlete. So anyways, that's my kind of initial rant there. I want to see if you guys have any initial thoughts there that we can kind of jump off of.
Yeah, I mean, I like it a lot in terms of like understanding that there's cost to each activity that we do, right? And considering that sometimes, that gets to be too much for us to recover from. And sometimes it's like, an actual, maybe something that we might define as injury, and you're feeling that for a couple of months. And in some situations, it's like, okay, the cost was higher than we liked it, but it's something we can mitigate in a week of like just changing the programming for the rest of the week a little bit, right? So one day, okay, we had to get this much work done, right? Or I had to pitch this many extra pitches just because the game called for it. Now you have to be adaptable and flexible in the rest of the week to consider that. So there's always historical context to what happened and what's happening next, right? Because this conversation about like maximum recoverable volume or intensity, it changes with the timeline of when your next game is. If it's like early in the off season, we have a little bit more wiggle room to like, okay, let's see where your tolerance line is. Let's see if we can push it closer to the tolerance. And if we overdid it, we have a little extra time to just like, mitigate that, to like lower the intensity and just come back from that. And that's a valuable experience of like, okay, we pushed it, it didn't go well, or it went well. We just get to be a little bit more courageous, I guess, in terms of that experiment. Whereas if you are in the last week of the season and you have the playoff coming up, that's not the time to be experimenting with how much volume or new modality or new exercise or new additional pitch count to just like be in play. So I think it is a decision that needs to be made with the context in mind for sure. But I love how, we have to think about not just the benefit of a drill activity, exercise, rehab, whatever, but also the cost of each of it and how it potentially affects the subsequent sessions.
Tanner, you got anything on that?
Not really, honestly. I think you guys both hit everything that I would have thought of. So
I'm going to kind of then jump back just a little bit. And I think one of the other things that came up in the Rob Gray podcast that I kind of want to touch on are some of the, and I think Tanner, you touched on this a little bit, some of the misconceptions or myths. And to every myth, there's a grain of truth to it. That's why it's become, the conventional wisdom. I think that's kind of the thing that I want to kind of cover is like, okay, what have we in the past, because this is something that they also talked about, was, okay, what are the past ways of addressing injury? And because I think, or how we think about injury and why we get injured. So I think one of the things that most people talk about is overuse. And so I think a lot of times there's the nuance missed of, okay, there's overuse, and then so we go to underuse, and then guys aren't properly built up. And so it's like, okay, how do we figure out how to best address these things? So some common things that are conventional wisdom, pitch counts. I think they're good, or I think there's a use for them. I think they're over relied on as a crutch. Traditional return to throw programs that you get from an arm injury that come from your general PT or AT. They also kind of some new stuff that I think is good too, like workload management, AC ratios, and then wearables, measuring all sorts of like arm speed, all that sort of stuff. I think all these things are good. I think the reason that I really liked the fact that Alan Jaeger was on Rob Gray's podcast is that his approach is very low tech. And I think the direction that a lot of the sport is moving is to try to quantify everything. And what I think, to me, from an ecological perspective, you have to take into the account like the fact that the organism is also a vital component to this. And when we are measuring things externally, there is a discrepancy between like whatever you're measuring doesn't encapsulate the whole thing. So like to me, another ecological principle is like the best model for the world is the world itself or reality itself, right? So the thing that I like a lot about Jaeger is his long toss program. And the big principle there is being able to listen to your body. And I think that is the thing that is probably missing, like in the discussion, is like, okay, are you measuring it? All this sort of stuff. And I think there's value to that, to have, say, for example, being able to track velocity in your on-ramp, some sort of, you could say guardrails. But at the end of the day, if the athlete does not have a greater awareness of their own body, their own system, and to be able to feel the onset of injury and knowing how to mitigate that, or knowing what to do based upon the signals that your body, or the information that your body is telling you or trying to speak to you, then I think you're going to end up injured. Your risk of injury increases regardless of whether or not you use any of these other approaches. Because I think at the end of the day, the most ecological way is to become highly attuned to all the relevant information. The knowing what is the specifying information when it comes to, if we're using measurables like a sensor or velo or whatever sort of technology, acute to chronic ratios, all this sort of stuff, you have to figure out what is the specifying information there. And then to me, the most important information that overrides everything is the information that your body is putting out there. And so I think that's why for me, Jager's listen to your body and listen to the arm and to feed the arm is the most low-tech, simple thing that I think everybody should begin to learn. So that's kind of, for me, one of the things that I really appreciated out of the podcast, and why I was super excited to see that Alan was getting brought into the kind of the Eco-D world a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I like some of the ideas that he brought up, like long tossing. It gets you out of your pitching mechanics, so then you can avoid that overuse of doing the same thing over and over and over again, and actually adding some variability. So I think there is some value to that, but I also don't think that you can, because I think some people like misinterpret what he says as like, oh, you need to max effort long toss every day. And it's like, no, the reason he's saying listen to your body is if you go max effort on Monday and your body's fried on Tuesday, you probably really don't need to throw Tuesday. Or if you do, it's, hey, let's play light catch to like 60 feet, feel good, listen to your body that way. And, I think there is value to it, especially with low tech. And I think the more we get into all the technology, kind of like what you said, Garrett, is that we get too, I guess, engulfed or too far into the tech that we ignore everything else.
We treat the tech as if it is the gospel.
Yep.
Like we let that be the final say on a lot of stuff. And it's not that you shouldn't ever let it lead you or whatever, but we almost treat it as if it's the gospel truth.
Yeah.
Like there's us being Westerners, we very much fall into scientism as being like our modern religion. Like it, and not recognizing the limitations of science and or measurables. Like everything has some sort of like error to it. It's more of a question of, is it consistent? Is it reliable in terms of its consistency, so that I can kind of judge things off of that? But you also need to understand there are certain limitations to that. But anyways, sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to throw that little piece in there.
No, that was good.
Trying to think.
So,
go ahead. Yep.
Should I kind of expand on it? I think.
Yeah, go for it.
It's a very similar conversation to like autoregulation, right? Like that's essentially what the fancier term of it is like some days throwing the same distance is going to feel much more difficult, right? And they do that in lifting world where like sometimes 200-pound deadlift feels like 300-pound deadlift, right? And that's part of the dynamical systems of like, it's the output isn't going to be exactly the same because there's way too many contributing factors, interacting components to the system that, things like sleep, things like stress, things like nutrition, time of the day, equipment, all these things play into it. And it rather than trying to figure out every single component that goes into it and try to control it, which is impossible. It's more of like, okay, we have a relative range of like where we want to be, but accepting the unpredictability and uncertainty within that of like, okay, we're going to try to hit my target in this range. But if I feel good, I'm going to go in the top range of that, right? Or like if I'm feeling really bad, I'm going to accept the same effort level. Like the target is the effort level of like 70%, 80% or whatever. And if I only have, 150 feet with that, like that's okay. You still got the work done, and you can be feel assured that that's still going to cause adaptation if that's the goal, depending on, like, it's not like we have to work at the maximum output in order to get adaptation. You kind of have to get adequate output for the day in order to just keep moving forward. And that's, I think, the beauty or the art to mixing the hard data and then the internal load measure, as in like what you feel at that output, and considering both at the same time, kind of relatively loosely, I guess, in a way, rather than like having hard rules of like, okay, today is 100% day. I just got to hit 90 miles per hour, right? But all right, some days you just don't have that. And if you try to go there, you are overloading your current capacity for the day because you just only slept for 4 hours, and you just are not going to get there unless you like really overload the system, right? So a little bit of acceptance of unpredictability, uncertainty, and flexibility of what the data is going to show is probably going to be helpful in that like marriage between external data and then internal load information that you're getting from your body. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to frame it. It's like pitching is very similar to like long distance running in a way, right? Like ideally you want to build a base and you almost want to run kind of a medium to low mileage, pretty frequently, but you have to have weekly or twice a week of like really high output, whether that's like long mileage or sprint work, right? So those would be kind of analogous to pitching in a way where you definitely want to be building a base volume, base endurance, I guess, in a way, knowing that you're going to be asked to put high effort, high output effort on a weekly basis. Does that kind of make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of maybe to try to transition a little bit to, okay, I think, well, maybe I'll back up a little bit. I think going back to trying to wrap up, like, okay, why injuries, right? I think oftentimes it's an accumulation of fatigue, right? And whether it's in an acute moment where a whole bunch of factors, like, let's say, for example, you become dehydrated, obviously all this stuff never happens in a moment, generally speaking, right? If we're talking about non-contact injuries, a lot of these things are an accumulation over time. But to me, dehydration is somewhat of an acute thing, right? Let's say it's a hot, humid day, and you get part of the reason that you get injured is you just weren't drinking enough water, or you became dehydrated, and all that culminated in the fact of on a normal day you'd be fine, but then you got injured there. Or it could be, but to me this is all, like, generally speaking, an accumulation of fatigue and or maybe not a proper warm up. Those both, like, two things can play in, right? So I think, yes, when we talk about it being a complex, there's complexity to it. I think there are some basic general principles, of accumulation of fatigue, not proper preparation. These are all things. And so then it becomes the question of, all right, how do we mitigate these things? Because one of the things, right, that has been brought up too, more recently, the pitch clock. And I think I don't think, that it's the end all be all, right? But at the same point, how much of you could say the zeitgeist of baseball has moved away from conditioning? Like, it's not popular to condition anymore. And that has kind of changed quite a bit. And now it's like But if you start thinking about it, okay, the initial thing was the energy system. Well, the sport of baseball is all done in the anaerobic energy system. But if you understand that the aerobic system is the system that recovers the anaerobic system, well, if that's underdeveloped or not developed enough, then you actually, because like you were saying, Yuji, the game of baseball is this weird dichotomy of like a lot of short sprints. Like that's what it is over a long period of time. And if we don't have the capacity to recover well, which is what the aerobic system does, then we're going to accumulate more fatigue. We're not going to be able to clear the fatigue. I think that's the biggest thing, when we're talking about different things of like, okay, yeah, you might have fatigue, you might not feel the best that day, but are there things that you can do to clear that fatigue so that you can actually perform well that day? Because at the end of the day, a lot of coaches are like, all right, are you available today? And so the athlete that has tools to help clear, let's say you don't feel great today, and if you don't feel great like lots of days in a row, it's almost like, well, I just gotta work through it today, and I got to go high intent today because we're on like day 5 or 7 or 14 of just feeling like, and sometimes you just got to work through it. So like, but that's the learning process. But anyways, to go back, I think that's one of the other, misconceptions is that aerobic work is like not necessary. And it doesn't look like you don't have to do poles. You don't have to run to work the aerobic system. There's so many different, as long as you're working the aerobic system, it doesn't matter how you do it. You want to sit on a bike, you want to go for a run. I think just we've demonized a certain portion of like a methodology or a principle, you could say, that is highly valuable. So, and then to go off of what you're saying, so now to transition, how do we mitigate injury risk? How do we help guys actually reduce their likelihood of getting injured? How do we build guys up?
Okay.
That's a loaded question.
Yeah.
Well,
no, it's a good one. Yeah.
Why do you think it's a loaded question? Why do you say that? I'm curious.
Because there's so much that goes into what could cause an injury. And I think to try, and I'm not saying this as like an easy way out, but like to try and cover all the bases, like turn over every single stone, I think is incredibly hard. And I think if all we do is focus on reducing injury, I think you actually run a higher risk of injury because then you're not doing enough to stress the system. I'm not saying like, oh, let's just go max effort 3 times a week and run your arms into the ground. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I think kind of like things we've already touched on, capacity, volume, frequency, intensity, like managing those things first, looking at their sleep and nutrition. And if they're lifting, like at MASH, I've had some kids like, yeah, why does my arm hurt? And my first question always is, are you in the weight room? And more often than not, it's no, I'm not. And then I ask why, and it's usually like, well, my parents don't want me lifting, or like I don't want to like get hurt in the weight room. And it's like, okay, well, let's get you in the weight room first, get you stronger, build capacity. And if there's still issues long term, then we can address it. Like, yes, I can give you some things to kind of help manage your pain, but in the long run, we need to make sure you're in the weight room. Or like just like things like that, like making sure that they're taking control of what they can control. And then we're kind of there to meet them wherever they're at. So if they come to me and are like, hey, I'm not feeling great today, well, obviously we're not going to push it. Like just kind of taking it day by day, I guess, is the best way I can explain kind of my approach to it. It's not like, hey, here's 4 weeks, you have to follow it exactly to a T because it's perfect. It's like, no, because I understand you're a human and you might not get great sleep the day before we go live. So like, you can go live at a lower intensity, or you can just not throw live at all today. And like being able to weave through programs and still follow it, but also like, okay, we're a little off track today, let's take a step back. Or I guess that's why I think it's a loaded question, is there's just so many factors that go into it. But looking at like, okay, what can we control? And if something out of our control comes into play, then we pivot instead of just like, here's a program, follow it exactly, or overdoing the recovery and not getting enough stimulus, and they go into their first game and blow something out because that is their first time being in an environment where there's adrenaline, where you're facing a hitter, where you're trying to throw an 0-2 fastball by a guy, like different things like that. They haven't done that. So because you're focusing on recovery and you don't want to stress it too much, then when they are put in it, it's like, oh shoot, arm snapped. Now, I don't know if that's going on at the professional level or not. My guess is some maybe, others no. But I don't know. That's why I think that's a loaded question. There's just so much that goes into it. To say that it's just one thing we can do, I think is almost naive.
I mean, at least to me, I think about it in terms of like the 80-20 rule, right? So like 20% of what you do derives 80% of the results. And so like I think about, okay, what things are not in my control as a coach, generally speaking. I don't control a person's sleep. I don't control what they eat, but what I can have the most control or influence over, I think, is like the programming that I give them, right? So for example, I think about like what we're kind of the basic principles. So that we've kind of discussed. I think the other one is progressive overload. So we want to progress things over time. And I think all coaches intuitively know this, right? This is why most coaches, they try to build guys up but I think this is where the spot that we could do better, right? Everybody right now, or not everybody, but most people are going to do a shutdown. We should talk about that at some point here, like our thoughts on shutdown, who that's appropriate for. But on the build-up side of things, because people don't have one, there's lots of issues. One, the frequency that we see an athlete. And so how frequent are you throwing impacts your ability to build up. And so, but a lot of people will do it just based upon bullpens, which will happen intermittently. And then they'll also do it based upon outings. So like your first outing might be, I don't know, 30 or 40 pitches, 50 pitches. And then you build yourself up to 75 and then you jump to 100, because this is the thing that I thought, we touched on is like the delta, right? Well, we have to increase the delta. So change is an inevitable part of what we're doing. Like if you go from 0 to, right, I've been shut down and now I'm going to start throwing, that delta is huge, right? Like, and so to say that like the delta is always a bad thing, like it's an inevitable part of the process. If we're going to, and so the question is how do we do it in the safest way possible where we mitigate the risk? I think a lot of this is about risk management. And so I think for me, that's kind of the thought process there of like, okay, how do we do progressive overload better? Or how do we progress things in a better way, given our, the circumstances we find ourselves in? Because let's talk about shutdowns, I guess. To me, when it comes to shutdowns, who is a shutdown most appropriate for? And who is it the least appropriate for? I think that is a thing, because right, if the thought is overuse, is the overuse injury, the thing that kind of stands out to me is that the reason why you can do what kind of Yuji and Tanner, you've kind of talked about, of like, okay, let's keep throwing, but at a lower intensity. Because what happens when we drop, let's say you've been throwing a lot and now you have this injury. And I think the biggest thing is like a lot of times we default to just like rest, don't do anything, just completely stop. And if we're talking about like the accumulation of fatigue and then clearing fatigue, simply dropping back right from a S&C principle, like, from the strength and conditioning world, powerlifting or whatever, a lot of times all if you do is deload, which is essentially you cut the volume and intensity, or you can cut volume and keep intensity higher. You can cut both, or cut intensity and keep the volume the same, whatever. What you're doing, the underlying principle is you're allowing the body to try to catch up, because the input that you're putting in is too much for it to be able to recover from. But if you leave enough stimulus, it's going to recover from that. So for example, right, if you use potentiation, you can, through a stimulus, usually intensity, you can prime the nervous system or excite the nervous system, and all of a sudden you get, in a way, super compensation, or where the system now all of a sudden can do something that it couldn't do before. And so I think in the same way, when we like always defaulting to do nothing to allow for recovery, which is sometimes appropriate, but more often than not, that is not the solution to go completely cut it out, because then there's consequences to that. When you rest for too long, you begin to atrophy, your coordination, all this sort of your attunement to the information and all that sort of stuff begins to degrade. So if you're able to maintain that, still move, because I think this is the other thing when we're talking about recovery, or even just like health of the system, movement, right? This whole notion of movement is medicine. And I think that's where like, okay, that to me is another component that helps athletes stay healthy, is like, I think, doing things at a higher volume. Like this was the other thing that Alan talked about. Like this is going back to what you were saying, Tanner, of people misunderstand, Jaggers or even Driveline, right? Like, oh, it's all just high intent throwing. And if you actually listen to, especially Jagger, his program is about low intensity oftentimes. It's low intent. Like you're working back, you're listening to the arm, and you're putting air under the ball, and you're being free and easy.
It's almost,
that's the main.
Yeah, it's almost like what we were talking about, like at runners, right? If you're training to run long distance, long and slow usually is what's going to help you build up that capacity. And I think it's, to put it simply, it's like cardio for the arm. Like it's not, we're going to go max effort. It's like, hey, we're going to get a nice run in today. We're going to go a little bit longer, but a little bit slower, or we're going to go moderate, or whatever it might be. But it's not increasing intensity and volume at the same time, because that's, I think, another thing that can contribute to injuries is when you try to do your increase volume and intensity, because those are two additional stresses, right? And I think as we increase volume, we get to a point that we can start to increase intensity. And then at that intensity, maybe we increase volume again. I think it's very difficult to do both. And I think Jagger does a good job of increasing the volume quite a bit before you get to that intensity. Does that make sense?
And I think it's important to build off of that we teach kids, because going back to what we were talking about, there's with social media, right? There's the image and the impression that is left on a lot of people that this is all it is high intent. And so this is where, a lot of kids, like they have no clue how to, or just even college athletes, nobody's ever given them principles or taught them how to warm up and play catch. Because a lot of guys will just go out there, and if their arm is kind of feeling it, or just, because you're just not thinking, you just go out there and you just huck it right out of the gate. And just having a conversation about here are the principles by which you should play catch by, and kind of how to think about it and how to listen to your body, listen to your arm. That has to be taught, I think. You're going to have a rare few that intuitively understand that, but because of all the different voices out there, it kind of, you kind of lose your way a little bit, and like, you get a little, you don't have as much clarity as for what it is that you're trying to do out there when it comes to playing catch, taking care of your arm, all that sort of thing. And so that's why I think it's really important to actually teach them, because I think a lot of coaches just think guys know how to play catch. Just go out there and warm up, go toss the ball around. You're old enough, you can figure it, you've done it enough, you can handle it. And I think, yes, that is in some ways true, but I also think, another way to try to pound this point home and beat a dead horse is you can always help them do it a little bit better. Right. And I think there's nothing wrong with taking a couple of days at the beginning of your season and just walk everybody through. This is how we warm up, how we play catch. And this is how you take care of your arm. Because, all of us, sometimes we forget. We get caught up in this or that, and we forget some of the basic principles. And so I think it's always good for coaches to just re-go over with guys on how to, here's the process by which, and the principles that underlie how to take care of your arm. And so that would be at least my thing that I would throw in there.
Yeah. I like that principles conversation. I wonder if it would be worth it to even take a step back and talk about, like, just like adaptation, like principles of adaptation, right? Because it applies to the weight room, where it applies to playing catch, throwing, applies to sprinting, applies to all of these things that we do physically. Like if we have conversations about like, okay, there's multiple ways to challenge the system. Sometimes it's by volume, sometimes it's by intensity, sometimes it's by variability, which is, I think, a great point that they brought up in the podcast. And sometimes it's by representativeness or like perceptual demand, right? All these things are kind of domains of an activity that we can kind of overload the system with, right? Like some activities are designed to overload intensity. Some activities are designed to overload volume, representativeness, perceptual information, all these things. And knowing that that's the goal, and what we don't want to do is overload all of them all at once, all of a sudden, right? Like if you have that conversation, like, and start to have them kind of build or gain knowledge of that whole conversation, right? Like going back to the information about autoregulation and just listening to your body, as they say. I think that's maybe the underpinning principle for most of the things that we're kind of just talking about today. Is like, okay, there's multiple ways to overload the system. Let's not do it all at once, early on, right away, right? So, because if you have that conversation, now you get to have further discussion, more zoomed in discussion about playing catch on the field, right? Like, okay, are we overloading the intensity today, or are we overloading the volume today, right? Or like, should we be overloading at all this week? So I think that might be just enough. They talk about just enough knowledge about to get started with knowledge of, right? So that might be kind of the principle that could be helpful, that now you can kind of like reference back when you're on the field, actually navigating that environment and those constraints.
And then for any listeners that are just jumping in, do you want to expand upon the ideas of, or the concepts of knowledge of versus knowledge about? Because I think that's a key concept that I think it's important for people to grasp.
Yeah. Knowledge, the simplest way that I've kind of conceptualized it is that knowledge about is more like verbal, right? Like it's things that you pick up from a book, right? Knowledge about principles, like it's explained to you via words, right? Whereas knowledge of is more experiential, right? So it's you being led out by a more experienced other that can kind of guide you through and figure out and wayfind. I'm just now throwing all the jargons at you, but again, verbal versus experiential, I guess that would be the simplest way. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, and more the ecological dynamics researchers would probably punch me for simplifying it too much, but I think that's kind of how I think about it.
Tanner, anything you want to add on that?
No, that's actually been, I guess, a principle that I've never really fully understood. Like I've kind of got it, but that makes a lot more sense. Like that's kind of on track with what I thought it was, but now that Yuji actually explained it, like I learned something today, so I'll take that.
Yeah, great. The little the 2 cents that I would add is, to me, knowledge about is declarative. It's thoughts, it's whatever. Whereas knowledge of is experiential, and oftentimes is, I'm going to use a big word here, ineffable, meaning like it's indescribable. It's very, you can describe it, but it doesn't encapsulate the true thing, right? And that's where it becomes, right? When the knowledge of, when I have to explain it to somebody else, it becomes knowledge about, right? And so that's how I delineate kind of the two, is like knowledge of is this thing that it's like a full body. It's a state of being. It's indescribable in some ways. And then when you try to describe it, it becomes knowledge about. So that would be my little thing there. And I think that's the thing that is important to remember is like, at the end of the day, performance is knowledge of. And so you're actually trying to, as a coach, through the knowledge about stuff, help them in their knowledge of. Like that's a supplement to the knowledge of. So anyways, trying to think, the guys got any other things that are standing out to you, that any affordances? Okay. I think going back to what you're talking though about principles, the other ones, that you're talking about, like, okay, how do we train? Like basic training principles. So for example, if we're talking about, I want to build capacity, the basic principles that I understand for building capacity are high volume, low intent. To me, that's like if I want to build capacity or I want to build volume, I want high volume, low intent. If I want to build velocity, I want high intent and probably lower volume, because if I want to be at my peak velocity, this is like sprint training, right? If I want to hit a PR, I got to be the least fatigued as possible. And so therefore, I'm going to not be able to do as many reps. So everything is relative, right? So for example, if I want to build capacity and I'm just starting out, because to me, right, the basic principle that I think we've gotten away from in the S&C world is you need to have work capacity. In order to do anything, you need to have work capacity. So that's your base. So then you build the base of work capacity, which is, GPP, general prep, right? And then on top of that, you begin to do all the other things. And so I think a lot of times we start, we got to build strength or we got to build velocity. So we actually start there and we kind of build the work capacity along with building the intensity. And I think that's where there's higher risk. You can do that and it'll work for some, but for others, there's a higher risk of injury. So to me, the most conservative way to go about it is to start with your base. And then on the energy system side, right, like work to rest ratios. So if I want to build the aerobic system, I need to have lower rest ratios, or more, things need to be more continuous. If I want to build the anaerobic system, I need to have higher rest ratios, work to rest ratio. It's like a 1-12 to like a 1-20 or 30 or something like that. And so like, to me, these are like basic principles that I think is useful for everybody to have, like that's how I begin to think about it. And then from there, we can kind of build these other things. Because when we go back to like shutdowns, I'm kind of curious your guys' thoughts on shutdowns. Like, who is that appropriate for? And then because then it's a question of like the on-ramp. Okay. So things take time to actually occur. So, if I want to build capacity, that just doesn't happen overnight. So this plays into the question of like shutdowns. Who is that appropriate for?
Can I go back to the capacity and intensity thing a little bit?
Absolutely.
I think it's going to depend on, to me, it's going to depend on like what each individual is more adapted to. Because it's going to depend based on what the role is, what you have done the last, previous season. Because, like it's a different conversation or a different demand for a starter versus a reliever versus a closer, right? So it's going to depend. Like I don't know that I would always approach like capacity as in like endurance and the volume first before building intensity. Because if somebody is, used to throwing high intensity for short period, like, yeah, the work is going to involve like potentially the leverage at least is to increase the endurance / capacity. But if you're somebody who struggles at higher intensity, right? Like you're experiencing more fatigue, like you can throw 100 pitches in a medium intent outing / bullpen and you might be completely fine. But as soon as you throw 10 pitches at, like at 100%, then the work is going to be higher intensity volume. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's still nuance in terms of what what the leverage is for each athlete is, right? Sometimes like you want to focus on building intensity first. Sometimes because I don't know if I'm making sense. I might be going into tangents here, but like we always have to think about what the leverage is for the individual that we're talking about is, right? Does
Do
that
you want to
make sense?
explain what you mean by
way too?
leverage? Like, how are you using that term?
So leverage, as in potentially another way to explain it, is like opportunities.
Mhm.
Like, what's an opportunity to give this person a little bit more options or competitive edge, I guess, right? Is it for them to be able to go longer at higher intensity, or for them to be able to go higher intensity? So those are things that I would consider in order to like make the program. Like, what's the need for the person?
So are you kind of talking about, you guys might have to remind me because it's been a while since I've used this language. Are you talking about like rate limiters? Right? Like, so
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
What's limiting the athlete, and what is the the closest, nearest, I guess you could say, I want to say like next closest good attractor. Because if I'm thinking from dynamic systems theory, a lot of times we have this idea of where an athlete should be, but that like state is so far away from where they currently are. And so I want to actually look to the next closest state that they can actually reasonably attain, and next to closest attractor state. And so like I want to work there, and it's more about the direction of travel. So like, right, is that kind of what you're kind of going on?
Yeah, I think you put that really perfectly. It's like, consider where they are at now, and consider where we would like them to be, or where they want to be, and what's the next step towards that. And sometimes that leverage is to challenge them with more volume, and sometimes it is to challenge them with more intensity.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree. It's like we can't do, like, volume is a little bit easier potentially to increase a little bit earlier. Same as like variability is like really easy to add on to like overload in terms of programming, because like we can't fake being unprepared for high intensity stuff. But if it's at low intensity, like there's a lot more room in terms of like going over, the tolerance by 5 pitches at, 80% versus going over it with 5 pitches at 100%. That cost is a lot more at higher intensity because each unit is, larger. But you put that really succinctly with just like understanding where they are, understanding where they want to go, and what's the next step.
Tanner, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you just said. I would also like to add on, like, what does the athlete normally do on their own? Like, are they guys who are like, I want time off, whether it's for physical reasons or just the mental load of what a season can do to you? It's a lot. And some guys just want time away. And then there are other guys that are just like, I only got 10 innings this year. Like, I want to go. Like, let's go. Like, I want more innings next year. So it's like, okay, we need the higher intensity and start building volume with that intensity. Or you might just have other guys that, yeah, they had a lot of innings, but they're just like, I still want to keep throwing. Like, that's just who I am. And then now if what they usually do is not functional for where they're trying to go, or it's been shown for them to not work, then it's like, okay, here's how we can give you some time off, but also how we can get you to where you want to go. So maybe instead of taking a month off, we take a week off, but then do a really long on-ramp for you, right? So then you can have a week, mentally get away from the game, give your body a break, whatever that athlete might need or really want. And it's like, hey, week 2, come in 2 to 3 times, get some light throwing. We'll move on to the next week and just take it really slow that way. Now, if they're needing higher intensity, then we might shorten that on ramp because there's so much nuance to whatever that athlete needs. But I think being able to adapt to who they are, what they want, what they normally do. Because my mind always goes back to that example I gave early in this podcast, that there was a pro guy that never shut down, but then all of a sudden his organization said, no, we need you shutting down for 2 months. Then he got hurt, couldn't rehab from it, ended up having to retire early. So it's just like, how can we give them what they need, keep them who they are, but also change their program and help them get to where they want to go?
And I think that for me is the frustrating part, and why I want to talk about shutdowns is I don't ever like this. To me, is the myth that like a shutdown is automatically better for the athlete, and I just don't think that's the case. Yes, I do think time away can be good, but what happens when you take time away? Those things begin to atrophy. Yes, there is some certain like recovery for certain things, right? I think the big thing that a lot of people come back to this is maybe where I want to call on some of your guys' experience, because I know when we talk about powerlifters, right? They all know that after a competition that they need to take some time away, or like need to like reduce, because those guys have been doing it for so long. They know that they're going to blow out tendons and ligaments if they just keep going, right? So they do some sort of deload, whether some guys will take complete rest, other guys, they'll do just lighter workouts. They'll do, and that's where I think, because I'm in my head, I'm like, where did this come from? Like, this came from some place of like, yeah, guys need to take 2 months off. Where did that number come from? I personally don't know where the history of that is, but I can begin to think of like maybe powerlifting, but maybe not,
Yeah, I mean, I almost think that came from just people trying to reduce injury risk. It's like, oh,
Right.
Overuse. Well, the obvious answer is take time off. Well, maybe it isn't the obvious answer. Maybe it is a deload.
Well, and I think that's where it's like, right, these extremes of like, we know, like at the time, right, with the information that we have at the time, that when you give guys off, they tend to, the pain goes away, right? If we're just looking at pain, right, the pain goes away, but then it's a question of like, how do we ramp you back up? And that's I think that when it comes to the shutdown becomes not as advantageous and almost a greater injury risk when you actually shut down. And that's kind of where I look at like, where's the balance here of okay, because I think this is to me like, and we've kind of already touched on it, like you can recover while still doing the activity. When I look back to Mike Reinold, maybe this will come up, but he did a study on weighted balls. But anyways, this is the big thing that I heard him talk about at Pitchapalooza when it came to time off. He's like, I just mean you're not doing competitive throwing. You're not on the mound pitching. He's like, I think it's fine for you to play catch. And I think that was the thing that was missed in the whole conversation of like a guy who is, as well credentialed as he is, saying that, yeah, because he says, yeah, you need to take time off. But people only listen to that part, and they didn't hear the second part where he said, time off can also include just playing catch. And I think, to what you're saying, Tanner, to go off of that, of what could it look like if an athlete says, I just need time away. I just have, too much stress or too much negative stuff right now currently associated with baseball. I need time away. But at the same point, they still need to throw to be able to make that on-ramp less steep. Because I think the steeper the curve for the on-ramp, the higher risk of injury. So it's like, how can we smooth that out? Well, let's say they don't want to pick up a baseball and throw. It's like, well, you know what? Go find some other throwing activity that you enjoy. And don't go too hard, like playing pickup basketball and you're just going hard in the paint, on your off days, and then you're just as injury prone because you're not actually giving your body time to recover. Like find that low intensity activity that you enjoy and have fun with. And that to me is a good way to like, what are we talking about when it comes to recovery? I think the mental fatigue is a huge component to injury risk. Like, this whole notion too, again, this is why I like ecological dynamics, right? We're looking at the whole system, the whole being, like this idea of embodiment, right? So your thoughts influence how your body recovers, how it feels, forget all the science, right? It's influencing your hormones, all this sort of stuff, right? So I think that's a huge piece of when we're talking about the off season and allowing time for the body to recover. Because I don't think we should talk about it in terms of shutdown. I think we should talk about like, how do we facilitate the most recovery, and in a way, how do we reset the body? I think maybe like that's the new way that we should begin to think about like the off season. How do we begin to reset the system to put it in a good position to rebuild it back up to be ready to go in season? Because from my experience, what I've seen is that more guys tend to get hurt on the on-ramp, not a ton, but it's because, guys, they fall out of their routine, right? Like that's the other thing, right? You stop throwing, your routine for throwing, going back to something that Alan Jaeger talks about, feeding the arm. All right. All of a sudden you stop feeding it. And now this routine that you have like kind of falls off, especially for young kids. And I'm in my context is junior college. So really they are young kids because they're 18 years old. They're coming just fresh out of high school. So they don't have all these types of routines. And so all of a sudden you tell them to shut down for a month, 2 months, whatever, their routine, they have less practice, right? When we're talking about young athletes, they have less experience. And so in order to gain more experience, you have to have more passes at a thing. And so it's about how do we manage that in a way that sets them up the best for success. And it's not, hey, just keep throwing necessarily. It's about how do we go about continuing to throw in a way that actually resets the body, that puts it in a good position, and allows it to recover. And I think that's the message that I at least want to get across is if you drop the intensity and maybe drop the volume for a certain period of time, the body can actually recover when you drop things back. Just to like, and it might actually be better that you continue to do something. I mean, this is the same thing, right? We've been arguing about this for the longest time. Lifting, guys are like, oh, I lift in the off season, then you stop in the in season. And we're like, that doesn't work. Now, if you lift in season inappropriately, yes, that's going to interfere with your performance. But if you do it like this, comes back to there's an appropriate way to do these things. And you can still get the benefits of taking time off or not doing a thing while actually still doing the thing.
What are your thoughts? I might be taking this in a different direction, but what are your thoughts with like the younger athletes, like 10 to 17 years old, where they're literally throwing year round? And it's like, how
are they throwing? My question is, let's give it a little bit more context. Yeah. How are they throwing? In what context are they throwing year round?
Spring season, summer season, fall season, then they go right into a winter training program. So like when we have those, it's like, in my opinion, I would want that age group to maybe play a different sport at some point. Does that make sense?
Well, and this is where, no, 100%. And I'm going to go more with your context, and I'm going to kind of plug and pump you guys or your situation a little bit here, right? I don't think, right, social factors here, right? And so, I look at your context. You work in a facility and you have these kids and you understand what they're going through. And so you create a training environment which accommodates for that, right? So you're the one being the adult in the room, you could say. Being the adult in the room, you're going to create a situation where they're going to experience different things. They're going to play different games that don't look like their sport to help mitigate that, right? Otherwise, it is, this is the whole cultural thing, the culture war, you could say, that's going on of multi-sport athlete, right? And I think that is true for the younger kids, right? Anything that I don't know what the age exactly is. I think it's somewhere between like 14 and 16 is when you kind of make that transition to you can kind of pare things down. But before that, I think you should play as many different sports as you can or do as many different physical activities and be involved in that, because oftentimes this is the thing, going back to the preparation piece. What does the season actually look like for these kids, these young kids, right? Like how frequently when they're in season are they playing? If they're playing a lot, then it does make sense to have some sort of on-ramp and a little bit of training around that, but if not, if the games are, spaced out, 3 days apart or whatever, one midweek and, a game or two on the weekend, like I think you can easily transition from one sport to the next. And it's not that big of a deal. Plus the other thing too, right? With the younger kids, like my kid, Ezra can, go throw all the time. Why? Because he don't throw that hard. Like he's not going to hurt himself, right? Like I think there's the level of the younger athletes, they can't produce as much force. So then therefore their injury risk is a lot lower. You have to push, they have a lot more capacity, right? They bounce back a lot quicker, right? And so I think it just kind of depends on the situation of like, how frequently are you playing as a young kid? What are you doing? Like, are you out in the backyard playing wiffle ball every day? You probably can handle that transition fairly well, right? So I think it just kind of depends upon your context. If you sit a lot, but these are things, right? Like you don't have a lot of control when you're working in a large group, right? So I think it's a question of, who am I talking to right here? Am I talking to a parent? Am I talking to a coach? The answer is going to be slightly different, but hopefully, people can parse that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So at least those are my thoughts on it. Shutdowns I think are appropriate for young kids.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was getting at too. And it's like, yeah, okay, so is this mainly when we talk about not shutting down, is that mainly for like higher level or older athletes where they are either, juniors and seniors in high school going into college and pro versus these kids? Because I'm sure parents may listen to this and they're like, oh, they said not to shut down, we're going to throw year round. And it's like, well, if your kid's 12 years old, he should probably just try another sport, see if he likes something else or she, and see what other benefits they can get from moving in different ways, running in different ways. And to me,
that's the shutdown is you go do something different, right? You go play another sport and you don't have to, it doesn't have to be, and it's okay if they pick up a ball and throw it, whatever, right? Obviously though, like it comes back to listen to your arm, like, but at the same point, if they overdo it one day and they're going to be playing this other sport for whatever, the next couple of months, like, so, they'll be okay, right? Because they're going to just not throw for the next, week or two or whatever and let that all dissipate. So I think to be clear, I think shutdowns are probably appropriate for most people like high school and lower. If you're going into like, I think college or maybe even like juniors, right? I don't know, there's that weird inner like liminal space, right? Of it depends again, how serious are you taking it / how much, I think you have to look at how much am I like, what am I going to be doing? Right? Like, so what am I going to need to be prepared for? If I'm going to, if I know my high school situation, right? Let's just use Texas as an example, right? That's way more intense. The high school, like if you're at a big high school, you may need to ramp up a little bit more because, or if, how coach runs practice at the beginning of the year, that it's like full bore day one, you're going to need to have a longer on ramp. But the thing is, at least in Minnesota, the season is like 12 weeks long. It's super short,
very short
for high school. And so the off season is massive. So like you have time to shut down and build back up because you have like several months to do that, right? Let's flip it to the college scenario. All right, you come in the fall in August. At least I'm going to use my context. Everybody else might be slightly different. Okay, you come in August. We're going to run till October. Okay, so we go basically till like early to mid-October. So, and then there's a gap. Let's just take the seniors, right? So they have their high school season, then their summer season. The summer season ends probably in July, usually. So there's a couple week like just dead period. And I think that's where guys can potentially come in and get injured right at the beginning of fall because they completely stop throwing, or they throw infrequently in that intermediate period before coming in. So I think that's a mistake a lot of guys make, or some guys can make, is to not throw. I think you need to throw consistently because when you come in, we fortunately, kind of like our first week is kind of like get acclimated week, and then we start up. But even still, okay, so then there's that. Then from basically like mid-October to basically, in our context, January 1, if you're D3, February 1. So like that's November, December, like that's 2 months, in a couple of weeks, right? In October. And so if you shut down for a whole month, you really only have November, December, in my context, to get ramped back up. And if you don't, some guys don't even start throwing till what, like around Thanksgiving or whatever. So that doesn't give you, and also think about, in my context, they're gone like in December. They go home for a couple of weeks. So I think when guys are the most vulnerable is in the early stages of the on-ramp. And so if you're not with them to guide them through that, and like, seeing that they're being consistent about it, I think that's where the greatest risk of injury is. And so for me, that's where, okay, doesn't make sense to like do that like month-long shutdown from like mid-October to right around Thanksgiving. Because Thanksgiving again is like a half week, right? So like our context is like you really only have like a little bit more than a month. Like obviously when we come back, we're not playing games, so we can still continue that on-ramp. But we're also wanting to see guys off the mound. And this is kind of the thing of like, how do we, like, yeah, you can do it, but are you doing it in a way that guys are prepared to get on the mound? Like, I think that's where I think, yeah, we didn't have very many arm injuries this year, which was great. Like we had guys break down at the end a little bit, but for the most part, as far as I could tell, like our guys were pretty healthy. We had one guy mess up his on-ramp a little bit and have like some bone bruising in his elbow, which again, like that's where I was like, man, was this worth it? To shut down when like our top arm had a little hiccup on the on-ramp. Like, does it just make sense to like, because this was the point that Randy in the podcast made of, does it make sense to be like only a couple weeks out? Like you maintain your throwing volume or whatever and intensity to a maintenance level, so that it doesn't, when you kind of putting the car in idle or you're kind of rolling and then you want to actually hit the gas, like it's easier, to get things going. So that's kind of my thought process. Oh, sorry to finish this out. Right. Okay. So then you go from that into the season, and the season rolls from January 1 to May or whatever. And then you start your summer season at some point. And then that, in college, then that takes you all the way back to basically July, and then you restart that process over again. So when are you going to take a month off? Because you always need to be ready. Mm-hmm. Like you're always, and that's where I think it's the hard part for the college guys of like, you almost do, or even pro guys, I don't know, their season is probably kind of similar of like, okay, you take time off, like, do you actually have enough time to on-ramp? Because an on-ramp, to me, in its most conservative, to give you the best chance to be healthy, is minimum 4 weeks. Like, I can do it in 2, but you can't on-ramp in a week. Like, that's pretty hard to be able to get on the mound and start, going. Like, yeah, you could, but like the risk is pretty tough. So I think minimum, like an on-ramp, is about 4 weeks, but I think they might have talked about it on the podcast. I mean, for me, from experience of rehabbing a guy, like it took 6 weeks, and it wasn't even a perfect on-ramp either. Like I wasn't happy with where he was at exactly. It was good enough. I probably needed another 2 to 6 weeks to really get him to where he needed to be. And so like, if you do a shutdown, you basically, where you do nothing, like you're starting from square one. You're starting at 0 and you have to build a guy all the way back up to whatever he needs to be. And then get to last piece on this, if you want to prevent injury, going back to that whole, like, you get injured when the demand or the intensity exceeds the capacity. Well, if I don't want to get injured, I have to build a capacity above the demand. So in my mind, if I'm doing this in the most conservative manner, to give myself the best shot, I need to actually overshoot the volume and intensity that I think they're going to experience. Now that's in a perfect world. That's, it's rarely going to ever happen, but like, I think it's good to keep that in mind.
I think this kind of comes down to like, there is a higher risk of on-ramp being too short than being too long. Because then you can like slow it. It's easier to slow it down, but we can't fake adaptation. We can't speed it up necessarily. So it's like, okay, we're moving a little too fast. We are, you're building intensity and volume up pretty quickly and like nice and smooth. We can take the next, week a little bit slower and kind of make sure you're not like overdoing it before the season. Like you can do that when on ramp is too long, but it's like there's higher risk of like, oh man, we are not where we need to be, and we start playing in 2 weeks, right? So I think that's the risk we might want to manage in terms of like, okay, there's a lot more room for error when it's like, okay, we're on ramping too long, with the caveat that like throwing can mean a whole lot of different things. Like it doesn't, and especially at lower volume, right? On ramp, we're not immediately going 100%, and throwing can mean like very different things. Again, throwing very different implements, throwing different weights, throwing at different distances, throwing on different, slopes, right? Throwing to hit somebody like dodgeball, or like throwing wiffle ball, and you get to like maintain that perception action coupling of like, okay, you're still competing against somebody at very low force situation. Or again, I think there's a lot more room to like define throwing, right? Like some of the things that we've done, Tanner, is like, okay, if like is working on external rotation isometrics that adds very similar forces to the system as throwing, but like I wouldn't define that as throwing, but it's like very similar. So there's grades of like, what kind of throwing is it? From baseball throwing off the mound is the most specific, to something that we do in the gym that kind of adds similar demand to the system as like being a lot more general throwing, quote unquote, right? So I think we can navigate that, specificity of throwing if we give it enough time for the on ramp. Whereas when it's too short, we're like, okay, we just got to throw baseball, and then we just got to like always play catch up, right? Does that kind of make sense in terms of like, if it's too long, there's a lot more room to play, and there's benefit from our perspective to incorporate things that are variable, like throwing in different, setups, windups, infield throws, jeter throws, all these things at lower intensity. There's benefit to that from this perspective, because we don't have to try to perfect the mechanics, right? Like that's not what we're trying to do. And even at lower force profile situations, are there opportunities to inject slices of the game and, keep them playing the game, but in a different way, if that kind of makes sense. And that's going to be beneficial to hitters too. Like what's the risk of like them not seeing pitches for 3 months? That's so high. Whereas like, can we do some sort of hitting activities? And again, earlier in the off season, it could be like just towel related things, like even like freaking tennis, racquetball, pickleball, like these things that ask you to, again, stay attuned to moving object, moving ball, and hitting with a extension of a body, right? Those are things that can lay on a general to specific demand profile that we can kind of navigate throughout the off season. And then when we have more time, we have more room.
To kind of go off of that, I think one of the other principles that I wanted to kind of get into is the SAID principle, right? Like specific adaptations to imposed demands, right? I get the first S right. But I think the other element too, like, I think we have to remember, right? And I think Randy talked about this. In order for the tissue to actually lay down, or the tissue to develop in a way that's going to be useful for what we're going to do, it has to be stressed in a similar way. And then going back to what you're talking about, like with the isometrics. But I think the other element too, with the SAID principle that I think is important, is talking about specificity versus variability. So going back to, like, the variability that is had within long toss. Yes, there's some variability, but it's not like a ton of variability. If, like, this is kind of the thing of, like, when we're talking about variability, sometimes we're like, oh yeah, it's variable, and that's a good thing. And you're like, okay, that's fine, but I don't think it's as much variability as you're, getting on about. Like, when I hear the word variability, I think like a large bandwidth of variability. But really, if we're talking about something like long toss, there is some variability there. And that's like, it's a question of, what are you trying to get out of a thing? With long toss, I'm trying to build capacity. That's what I'm trying to get out of it. And there are some auxiliary, benefits, yes, there's some variability there. But if we're talking about it transferring to the mound, there's not enough specificity, right? And so, like, if you're doing all that and thinking that you're going to throw harder on the mound, even on like a pull down or a running gun, we don't see as much transfer. And why is that? Because it's not specific enough. And I think that's where we have to come back to, of like, when we're talking about variability and all these sorts of things, like, what are we using it for? And sometimes, yes, variability can help you unlock certain things on the mound and have transfer. But that to me is more of, if we're talking about a principle, like, that's the Hawthorne effect. You introduce some novelty, and it allows you to, if we're talking about, use an analogy here with machine learning and algorithms, right? You can overfit to the data. You can lose the forest through the trees, so to speak. And the variability helps open you up to be able to see and to make a connection that you otherwise couldn't make, because you're just so, like, up and close and personal to the problem. And so to me, that's where we have to understand, when it comes to variability, how is it good? How is it useful? And I think that's where it's kind of useful. And then otherwise, specificity really matters. Representativeness matters, because representativeness also makes it more specific. So there's still variability within, like, a representative environment, but the variability starts to narrow to the variability within the game. And so that's where I think specificity is something that we can't lose, when we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about variability. And so I think that for me is like another potential, like, misconception that I at least wanted to talk a little bit about or address, so that we have to keep in mind specificity when we're talking about variability.
So with the long toss stuff, I think how I would want to implement it is to increase variability in terms of, like, the approach to the long throw. They talked about crow hop, but, like, okay, like, why are we doing it that way? Like, you define it as a problem solving process for getting the ball to a far spot, right? How can you do it when you do it with a crow hop versus a shuffle versus just standing on one leg, or single leg hop, or curved sprint, right? Like, that makes this different activity that's not pitching activity, but with the mindset of, like, overloading the output potentially. And how can you solve that problem in a bunch of different ways? Now that person is becoming a better problem solver for that higher output problem. And that, to me, might translate to the mound stuff. But if you're doing the long toss, but in the same way over and over and over again, being happy with the fact that it's variable because it's different from pitching, that to me is not a problem solving activity, right? It's not making the person a better problem solver, because you are just practicing the same long toss thing and being happy that there is a inter-task variability. That's a different task. But in a different task, can we increase intra-task variability, meaning how you solve that one problem? Now that's like, zooming out and helping the person learn to move, right? So again, it's one step further in terms of adding variability in things that make it like things that make the problem variable instead of being happy with that it's a different problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think the one thing I would add is that every task is to put a little nuance on this, every task is a problem solving task. Now, the question I think comes back to, if we're talking about it from a dynamic systems standpoint, attractor wells. So like, the more you do the task the same way over and over again, the more you're going to become more efficient at it, which is okay. But then the attractor well gets more narrow. So your bandwidth and what you can tolerate or what you can do begins to narrow. So if we want to stay flexible and adaptable, we need to intentionally sometimes vary what we're doing to be able to maintain the bandwidth of what we're doing, of the skill, and to have more flexibility. But to your point of like, I think this is where it becomes what you just described of, okay, how many different ways, right? Because to me, this is changing the frame. If you want to reduce overuse injury, doing the same thing over and over again can increase capacity, but it can also, all you're going to do is you're going to hypertrophy or strengthen certain muscles and neglect others. So then your bandwidth of what you can tolerate, your capacity, is only within a narrow bandwidth. The more that you're doing what you're talking about of like running in different ways to throw the ball and get it there and whatever, that is going to stress the tissues in different ways, and it's going to build the capacity of those tissues in a wider bandwidth. To me, that's where like this all of a sudden becomes, why are we doing this, right? And yes, you become a better problem solver. Your problem solving capabilities now expand from, instead of just being able to solve a problem just doing a crow hop, now all of a sudden you can actually solve that problem in a lot of different ways. If you're an outfielder, all of a sudden this becomes a lot more relevant. But anyways, I digress. So I think we're coming up on like our time limit. So I kind of want to put a pin in this because there's so much, like long toss, I think, is a great tool. And to leave people with, you want to begin to think about what is it that you're trying to get out of what you're doing, and how can you make it more ecological? So maybe this is the thing of like, I want to leave this kind of ending question of like, how can we make something like a task when we're thinking about preventing injury, you could say, or reducing the risk of injury or preparing an athlete? How can we make something like long toss, which is a tool or a method, how can we make that more ecological? So I think you kind of described, throwing in different ways, but what are some underlying principles that I think why do we want to approach it this way?
Variability is good. Right. And we're trying to make, help a person become a better problem solver by changing the parameters of the movement problem. Right. So for a long toss, the one constant is the output, right? Like you're trying to get it as far as you can or whatever distance, but can you do it in a different way? Right. So keeping the eyes on the prize of like, the output is what we're trying to get, but we're going to do it in a bunch of different ways. Right. So it's the secondary constraints that we can manipulate to add variability to like that makes it a little bit more ecological dynamics friendly or more transfer friendly, I think, in my mind. I don't have like a super clean one sentence principle, I guess, but you might be able to kind of capture it a little bit better.
Tanner, what do you got? What do you think?
I don't know. I just, it goes back to the question of like, why are we doing this? I think that's like the biggest thing. Like I'll get parents asking me all the time, why are they playing this kickball game that you just made up as a warm up? It's like, well, they're sprinting, they're catching, they're throwing, and they're having fun. So like we're working on all these skills. Now these are like 9 to 12-year-olds that I'm doing these games with, but like they all play another position where they're going to have to catch. They're all going to throw. I mean, they're in this pitching class, so they all throw, and they're getting some sprints in and they're having fun doing it. Right. And then when you get to the older guys, it's like, okay, why are we throwing different weights of baseballs. It's like, well, we're trying to increase, the capacity of the arm, or we're training variability with command, or why are we always on a mound? Well, it's like, that's where you're going to make your money. And I think, why are we long tossing? Since we're on that topic, it's like, what are we trying to get out of it? If it really is variability, then let's truly go into that variability aspect, because like Yuji said, variability is good. So let's take advantage of it, because it is, I don't want to say it's low intensity, but it's definitely not max effort. So there is more bandwidth for variability within those activities, I think. But like going back to that question of just why are we doing this? And if we can't think of a good reason, then do we need to be doing it?
Yeah, and to kind of go off of that, like I think the principles that for me are like going back to, okay, why are we doing this? To me, the other way to phrase that is, what's your intent? What's your intention? Because right, like in ecological dynamics, intent shapes a lot of what you're doing. So having a clear intention for the athletes, having in your mind to a clear intention of like, what are we trying to get out of this? Secondarily, we need to ask like, okay, how representative is it? And it's okay not to be very representative, but it comes back to like, what am I trying to get out of it? If I'm just trying to simply warm up the body, warm up the system, the perceptual system, everything, right? Doing like what you talked about, Tanner, playing a game that doesn't look anything like baseball, totally okay. Because that's not the intent. The intent was not to be highly representative. And we have to understand, like what are we trying to get out of it, and not overhype a thing, and recognize like if I'm long tossing, this is a supplement. It's not my full nutrition thing. This is not what's going to give me the greatest carryover, but it's trying to set me up for the next thing of being on the mound, right? And so I think that's kind of where we have to, like, if I'm thinking about some basic principles, it's like, okay, what's my intention? And then how representative is this? Are some good ways to begin to think a little bit more ecologically about the activities that we're doing. So anyways, I want to, I hope this was a good conversation, and I would like, potentially, I think we only touched on some things. Like I'd like to get into more of the practical stuff. I think that's kind of the thing that a lot of people, okay, we talk about some theory, but how does it practically get applied? What does it look like? Mm-hmm. And so, hopefully you guys would be willing to jump back on at some point and kind of dive more into that.
Yeah, definitely.
But to do outros, where are you guys at? Where can people find you? If they liked what they heard from you guys here today, how can they follow what you're doing? Or even to give kind of a little blurb on what you guys are up to and doing currently.
Yeah, right now, for me personally, I'm in the middle of a town ball season. I'm kind of putting all the things that I guess Yuji and I are doing together on my Instagram at TJP_training. So if you're curious of just, I guess, one of how Yuji kind of goes about some of his exercises, workouts, or how we design, I guess, practice sessions, go ahead and take a look on there. I guess that's the main place where I post. Twitter, if anybody's interested in that, TJ Pruett 2310. That's going to be where I post more of like educational stuff and theory and all of those things. So if you're interested in anything that I discussed, I probably touched on it at some point on my Twitter feed.
For me, Twitter is Yuji Suzuki DC, and Instagram is Huge Gains. So YUJGAINS. Those are my handles.
Awesome. Well, people should follow you guys on those spaces. And so until next time.